thousands of years ago, long before the rise of Mauryas, the Guptas, or the great kingdom remembered in later Indian history. The northwestern part of the Indian subcontinent was already a world of powerful tribes, warrior chiefs, priests, cattle herders, and competing political communities. There were no modern borders, no enormous centralized empire. Power belonged to communities, clans, and kings. And this ancient world, the rivers were everything. They provided water, they supported agriculture, they sustained cattle, they connected communities, and they could also become the stage for war. One of the earliest major conflicts remembered in the Vedic literature took place in this world. It is known as Dāśarājña, the Battle of the Ten Kings, a conflict in which a king named Sudas faced a powerful coalition of rival tribes, and according to the ancient hymns of the Rigveda, Sudas won. Imagine the landscape of the early Vedic period: wide grasslands, forests, herds of cattle, horse-drawn chariots, small settlements scattered across the river valleys, and flowing through this landscape were some of the great rivers of the northwest. For those communities, a river was not simply part of the landscape, it was life itself. Water meant food, food meant cattle, cattle meant wealth, and wealth meant political power. That is why rivers could also become strategic locations. The Rigveda remembers the Battle of Ten Kings in connection with a river called Paruṣṇī. This river is generally identified with the modern Ravi River. It was here, according to the Vedic account, that Sudas faced a coalition of his enemies. At the center of this story stands one man, Sudas. Sudas is associated with the Bharatas and with the Trasus, and he is one of the most prominent human figures mentioned in the seventh Mandala of Rigveda. The Vedic poets remember him as a powerful and successful king, but Sudas was not simply a warrior. Like other rulers of the period, his authority existed within a network of relationships. Warriors supported him, tribes followed him, and priests provided ritual and political legitimacy. One of the most important figures associated with Sudas was the famous Vedic sage Vasishtha, and that relationship becomes important when we examine the political tensions surrounding this war. Look closely at the army surrounding Sudas. This was not an army like those of later Imperial India. There were no massive standing armies controlled by a centralized bureaucracy. Instead, military strength depended heavily on tribal and clan-based organization. Warriors could fight with bows, spears, and other weapons. Horse-drawn chariots played an important role in the warfare described by early Vedic literature, and behind every king stood the people and resources that made warfare possible: cattle, horses, land, food, weapons, and above all, loyalty. The strength of a king depended upon his ability to bring these forces together. Sudas appears to have been particularly successful at doing exactly that, but his success also created enemies, and those enemies would eventually unite against him. Beside the king stood the priest, Vasishtha. In the Vedic world, the role of the priest was far more significant than the modern word priest might suggest. Vedic ritual was closely connected with kingship. The relationship between ruler and priest could strengthen the king's authority and provide religious legitimacy for his rule. The Rigveda contains hymns for associated with Vasishtha's relationship with Sudas. The poet praised the king, and they praised the divine powers believed to have supported his victory. This is important because the Rigveda is not a modern military textbook. It does not describe war through statistics and battlefield maps. Instead, military victory is presented through poetry, ritual, and religion. For the Vedic poets, a king's victory could also be understood as a sign of a divine favor. And then we encounter another famous name, Vishamitra. Later Indian tradition remembers Vasishtha and Vishamitra as two legendary sages engaged in a long rivalry. The historical details behind those later traditions are difficult to establish, but the Rigvedic material does preserve evidence of political and priestly tensions surrounding Sudas. This tells us something important about early Vedic society. Political power and ritual authority were closely connected. A king needed warriors, but he also needed legitimacy, and priests were powerful figures within that system. So, behind the Battle of Ten Kings may have been more than a simple territorial confrontation. They were competing political interests, competing alliances, and competing networks influence. Eventually, those tensions erupted into war. Sudas was now facing something much larger than a single rival. The Rigveda names numerous people connected with the conflict. Among them are the Purus, Anus, Druhus, Yidus, and Turvasas. Other groups are also mentioned in the hymns associated with the battle, including the Bhaktas, Bhalanas, Alinas, Sivas, and Isanids. This is where the traditional names comes from. Dāśarājña, the Battle of Ten Kings. But we need to be careful. This phrase should not be interpreted as a through 10 model-style kingdoms formed a perfectly organized alliance with 10 clearly identifiable nation borders. The political structure of the period was very different. The exact composition of the coalition remains and debated by historians. What the ancient poetry clearly remembers is a major coalition confronting Sudas. The opposing force moved toward the river. Warriors marched through the across the plains. Chariot carried fighters and leaders. Horses moved through the dust, and somewhere ahead was the Paruṣṇī. The battlefield was becoming unavoidable for Sudas. The stakes were enormous. If the coalition defeated him, his political position could collapse. If he survived, his victory could strengthen the position of the Bharatas. This was not simply a contest between two individuals, it was a struggle over political influence in the Vedic world, and soon the river would become the center of the conflict. The ancient name of river was Paruṣṇī. It is generally identified with the Ravi. Today, the Ravi is one of the great rivers of the Punjab region. But imagine it thousands of years ago, this landscape would have been different. The river would have shaped settlements, grazing grounds, and movement across the region. And during war, the river could become both an obstacle and an opportunity. The Vedic account gives the river a dramatic role in the destruction of Suda's enemies. The enemies attempted to overcome the natural challenges of the river, but their plan failed, and the water became part of their defeat. Now imagine the moment before the battle. Two forces facing each other, one on one side, Sudas and his followers on the other. a coalition of rival groups. The air is filled with dust. Horses move nervously. Warriors prepare their weapons. Chariots wait for the command to advance. There is no modern communication, no radio, no satellite intelligence, no artillery. Battle depends upon comrades, messengers, terrain, and the ability of warriors to maintain formation. And when several political groups fight together, coordination becomes even more difficult. The coalition may have possessed the numbers, but Sudas had something equally important, a unified command. Soon the silence would end. The armies collided, arrows filled with the air, warriors advanced with spears and shields, chariots moved across the battlefield, horses charged through clouds of dust. The Vedic poets describe the conflict with the language of heroic warfare. They celebrate Sudas, they praise his strength, and above all, they praise Indra. For the Vedic poets, Indra was the great warrior deity, the protector of his followers, the destroyer of enemies, and the divine power associated with victory in a battle. The important point is that Rigveda presents Suda's victory through his religious value. It is not simply Sudas had a better army. It is Sudas was victorious with divine support. The chariot was one of the most visually distinctive elements of warfare in the Vedic imagination. A warrior standing on a moving chariot had mobility that an infantryman did not. The chariot could move rapidly across suitable terrain. It could carry a warrior and equipment, and it became strongly associated with elite warfare in ancient Indo-Iranian and Vedic traditions. But the battlefield was not simply a collection of chariots. Thousands of individuals could be involved in a conflict of this scale. Infantry, archers, spearsmen, horse handlers, drivers, leaders, and support personnel. Every victory depended on the combined strength of this entire system. Then came the turning point. Sudha's forces struck back. The coalition began to lose cohesion. The Vedic hymns remember Sudas as the victorious king. The enemies were overwhelmed. Some were defeated. Others attempted to escape. And the river that had seemed to offer an advantage became part of the disaster. This is one of the most striking elements of the ancient account. The battle was not remembered merely as a contest of weapons. The environment itself became part of the story. The river, the terrain, the movement of the armies all contributed to the outcome. The Paruṣṇī was now at the center of the catastrophe. The Vedic poetry describes enemies being overwhelmed by the waters. Some modern interpretations have suggested that flooding or manipulation of the river environment may have played a role, but the precise historical mechanism remains uncertain. This is an important distinction. The Rigveda clearly remembers a devastating defeat connected with the river, but we cannot reconstruct every physical detail of the battle with certainty. What we can say is that the river became one of the central images of Suda's victory. The coalition that had gathered against him was breaking apart. The Great Coalition was defeated. The Vedic poets describe the destruction of Suda's enemies with powerful and sometimes highly poetic language. The exact casualty figures are unknown, the exact battlefield formation are unknown, and many details of the conflict remain uncertain, but the outcome is clear within the Vedic tradition. Sudas had won. A king who had faced a coalition of rival tribes emerged as victorious, and that victory mattered because wars do not end when the fighting stops, they change the balance of power. For Sudas, this was a triumph. For the Bharatas, it was important moment of political success. And for the Vedic poets, it became something more. It became memory. The victory was preserved in sacred poetry. Generation after generation could hear the story of the king who defeated the coalition. Sudas was not merely remembered as a survivor, he was remembered as a victorious ruler. And the victory strengthened the political importance of the Bharatas with the Vedic world. After the battle, ritual and memory became inseparable from victory. The Vedic tradition did not separate religion and politics in the way modern societies often do. Kingships had a sacred dimension, ritual had political importance, and victory could be interpreted as evidence of divine power favor. The heavens before therefore praise Indra for helping Sudas. For modern historians, this does not mean that we can treat divine intervention as a historically verifiable battlefield event. Instead, it tells us how the people who preserved these humans understood their world. To them, the victory of their king was connected with the cosmic and divine order. And then the battlefield became quiet. The survivors returned. The warriors went home. The horses and cattle remained symbols of wealth. The settlements continued, but political history had changed. A defeated coalition could no longer exert the same pressure as on Sudas. The Bharatas had demonstrated their strength, and the memory of this victory would survive long after the warriors themselves had disappeared. This is one of the extraordinary powers of the Rigveda. It preserves fragments of a world that would otherwise be almost completely lost to us. The Bhartas now stand at the center of our story, but we should be careful with the word Bharta. The ancient Bharatas were a Vedic political community. They were not identical to the modern Republic of India. Between the ancient Bharatas and modern Bharat lie thousands of years of political, linguistic, and cultural development. Yet their story is still historically significant. The Bharata name survives in later Indian traditions, and the political world of the early Vedic period would continue to develop over time. New alliances and political formations emerged. Among the most important were the Kurus. The later Kuru polity became a major center of Vedic culture and political organization. Centuries passed, small tribal communities gradually developed into more complex political formations. Ritual traditions became more elaborate, settlements expanded, agriculture grew in importance, and political organization changed. The world described in the earliest Vedic humans were gradually transformed into the later Vedic world. The Battle of Ten Kings was not the beginning of Indian civilization. Civilization does not begin with a single battle, but the conflict is an important glimpse into the political struggles that shaped early Vedic society. It shows us a world that was already politically sophisticated, competitive, and deeply connected with ritual and tradition. And now we come to one of the most fascinating parts of this story, the name Bharata. In the Rigveda, Bharat refers to an ancient Vedic people. In later Sanskrit literature, the name echoes broader meanings. The great epic tradition speaks of the Bharatas. The name becomes associated with the land and its people in later Indian cultural memory. And thousands of years later, the name still survives. Not because ancient and modern political identities are exactly the same, they are not, but because names, stories, and cultural memories can survive enormous historical transformations. Today, the word Bharat remains one of the names of the Republic of India. The modern nation is vastly different from the tribal word of Sudas. Modern India contains hundreds of languages, countless communities, enormous cities, and constitutional political system. It cannot simply be projected backward into the Vedic period. Yet there is something remarkable about the survival of that time. A name associated with the ancient Vedic community appears again and again through later Indian literary and cultural traditions, and eventually becomes part of the official name of a modern republic. This is not a simple straight line through history. It is something more interesting. Today the Ravi flows quietly, the armies are gone, the chariots are gone, the ancient settlements have disappeared or transformed. The warriors who once stood beside this river have been dust for thousands of years, but the river remains. And somewhere in the ancient poetry of Rigveda, the memory of the struggle remains as well. The Battle of Ten Kings was not the birth of India. It was not the first war ever fought in South Asia, and historians cannot reconstruct every detail of the battle with certainty. But it is one of the earliest major political conflicts preserved in Vedic literature, a story of kings, tribes, alliances, peace, rivers, war, and memory. A king named Sudas stood against a powerful coalition. The coalition was defeated. The Bharatas rose to dominance, and the poets preserved the victory. Thousands of years later, we can still read their words, we can still trace the ancient river, and we can still ask what that distant will tell us about the long history of that civilization that followed. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson of the Battle of Ten Kings. History is not only found in monuments, sometimes it survives in a river, sometimes in a name, and sometimes in a poem. This was the Battle of the Ten Kings, the Dāśarājña remembered in the Rigveda and preserved to across the centuries, fade to black